where people can hear the word Mahakani spoken. That would sound like a really minor thing. But for most Muslim peoples, their ancestors are here. Their ancestors get to hear their own language spoken again in this place. That's important. That's not a meaningless gesture. But that's another first step. How can we make this tangible? How can we make this real? When the steering committee and I decided to apply for this Mellon grant, this opportunity came up for a Humanities for All Times grant. We decided, well, what would it look like to build a curriculum around this? For years, students have been asking, why don't we have a Native American and Indigenous Studies concentration? The short answer is because we don't have enough people to teach classes on a regular basis. There are two of us who've been doing this. That's not enough to staff a concentration. So how do we build this? How do we find ways for people who are here, who aren't tied to the settler colonial past, to make sense of this history? How do we connect this? So rethinking place was a way to help students connect to being at large, to think about the complexities and nuances of this relationship, and also to think about the experience of the Stockbridge Munsee themselves, who had to make a home on the homelands of other Indigenous peoples. This offers a space to have classes, to do programming. But we did this with an emphasis on being guided by the priorities of the tribe, right? That we are constantly in dialogue with the Office of Cultural Affairs, that we have allocated grant funds to bring delegations of the tribal council here to their homeland, so they don't have to pay to come home, so that we can send the steering committee to Wisconsin, which we're going to do next summer, to go and talk and consult with the community in their homelands, in their new homelands, so that we can be guided by their priorities, so that we make sure that any project that touches on Stockbridge Munsee language, culture, or history is vetted by the tribal council, right? They get to say whether this is appropriate or not. It's not for us to do this. And to also remember, our timeline might not be their timeline. Mellon gave us 36 months, but I have to always hold in mind, 36 months, that's a drop in the bucket. Right? This is a relationship for life. So how do we set up a framework of trust that we're constantly coming back to? When there was a change in the Office of Cultural Affairs, a new director came on board with different priorities, different set of foundations. That changed our relationship. So we're now in the process of recertifying this text. This is not a text set in stone, right? This is a text that is always going to be guided by what the tribal council thinks is important to say. So we're waiting for them to say whether they're happy with how it looks right now, or if they want other priorities to be brought into this as well. From our side of BARD, what we can do is develop curriculum, to do public advocacy, to create space for Stockbridge Munsee priorities, to think about what kinds of educational programs for Stockbridge Munsee youth we can bring here, but also to create space for other Indigenous voices. One of the reasons why we have an arts residency built into the grant for an enrolled tribal citizen is to create space for contemporary Native artists, not to look back in the past into some authenticity that was created by the US government or Blood Quantum or Hollywood, but for contemporary Native artists to actually have space to think about their own practice and for us to support that with no asks on them, right? It's not about what they can do for us. It's about creating space so that they can engage in fulsome exploration as they see fit. And think about what they might want to tell us when they have the time for that. Our programming for this year is going to be on archives. We have two amazing keynotes coming in. Larissa Fuentes, who's a scholar of the recovery of enslaved women's voices in Barbados, and Elizabeth Ellis, who's a Peoria citizen who works on the Petite Nations of Louisiana. We have two incredible postdocs who have joined us for the next 2 years. Luis Chavez, who is an ethnomusicologist who works on indigenous traditions in northern Mexico, and is going to be teaching a class this fall on American Indian philosophy and religion. And Margot Christensen, who is a cultural geographer who works on the Barrier Lake Algonquin Nation and activism in the 1960s, who's going to be teaching a class on indigenous feminism, doubling the number of courses that we've been able to offer in NIAS. I think before I stop and open the space up for any questions you might have about this process, about land acknowledgements, about Native history here, I want to invite you to think about, if this is the first time that you have heard BARD's land acknowledgement, I invite you next time you're on a device with Wi-Fi, to look up native-land.ca, and I'll make sure that you get the website for this. It's a nonprofit website that helps you to identify whose homelands you're on at any given point. And I encourage you to take a walk, if you haven't on campus, to look at the signs that were funded by the Lumina Foundation and put together by Professor Armstead's talks, to think about the kinds of histories that are here. If this is the second or third time that you're hearing Bard's land acknowledgement, I invite you to think about taking a deeper step. And maybe that means enrolling in a class that thinks about placemaking, or that thinks about Indigenous traditions or history. Or maybe that means picking up Whereas, the beautiful book of poems by our MFA alumna, Lily Long Soldier, who came and gave you an amazing talk last week. Maybe that means thinking about your own friends or your own community, or if you're engaged in some kind of project, creating space for Indigenous makers, artists, intellectuals, thinkers, entrepreneurs, how you can help to support that. Maybe it means the next time you're sending a care package to a friend, thinking about maybe patronizing a native business like Kickapoo Chef Crystal Wakapa, who's based in Oakland, who sends native treats all over the country. So I really want to encourage you to see the land acknowledgement for yourselves as a point of departure, as a way of thinking about placemaking, but also really taking that step to think about what futurity might look like. We need to know the past, but our commitment is to the present. So I will leave it at that. Floor is open for questions. Questions moderator will be moderating this, but my office is always open to you anytime you have a question, anything you want to know. If I can help you or connect you in some way, it would be my pleasure to do so. So thank you for having me here today.
Thank you, Christine. Okay, we have about 10 minutes-ish, or a little more for questions. So the floor is open for you to explore some of these themes with us. Yes, down here.
Can you talk a little more about that forced removal when did that happen? Who was the first settlers after the 80s?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the same way that in Atlantic slavery we talk about many middle passages, one of the ways that I think it's really helpful to think about removal is many forced removals. So in 1609, Henry Hudson sails up the Monoconto, and by virtue of seeing it, decides, oh, I'm going to claim this. I'm going to claim this for a European empire, even though there are people living here, and I'm totally reliant on their goodwill and generosity. And then by 1624, you have Dutch settler colonists arriving first in Manhattan, or what we would today call Manhattan, creating an outpost, a trading outpost, and buying, thinking in their mind they're buying something that they cannot buy. What they're being given is use rights to share that land, and creating Fort Orange, which is now Albany, right? So on the southern and northern end of the rivers, you've got this settler colonial population. And very quickly, you have a push to remove the Navajo, Shinnecops, Pequots, Mohegans violently from these places. So one of the things that you hear in the name Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohegan Indians, right? This is a community that was formed by people being dispossessed further to the south, moving north to kin, to relatives, to cousins, to people who had similar linguistic and cultural traditions, and being taken in as refugees because of the violence that they were experiencing. So that first removal is the early 1600s. And then after the Dutch colony becomes an English colony in 1664, and all of these English colonists surviving, settling, first in the south, then moving up the banks of the river. This is, as you can tell, a very rich, productive region, right? Tons of orchards, tons of farms. People love that land. And so as more settlers pour in, and they bring with them forced migrants, right? People of African descent. New York is the largest slave port in the north. So settlers who don't want to be here, but are being forced to come here to physically change indigenous homeland. Native peoples are being moved from this area to western Massachusetts, then back to New York, then to central New York. They're being moved into the homelands of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy. And this is taking place from the 1750s to the 1800s to the 1820s. And every time indigenous peoples go to court to say, oh, we have a treaty, you can't do this. The court's saying, oh, we're really sorry, there's nothing we can do. I mean, we can't enforce the law. And the reason forced removal is so important in this document is people know about, if they know about forced removal, if you've ever heard about Indian removal, you've probably heard about the Cherokees and the Trail of Tears, where the police really cry. We associate that with the Southeast, and we think, oh, it didn't happen in the Northeast because all the Indians were gone. Well, they're gone because we made them move at gunpoint. So that notion of forced removal is an acknowledgement of the denial that has taken place here. Oh, we didn't have slavery in the North. Yes, we did. Professor Armstead can speak more to this. We didn't remove Indians. Yes, we did. So there's a complicity to this. And it's a long history, right? The 1840s, people think that's like, oh, pre-Civil War, Industrial Revolution, Cotton Kingdom. There were Native peoples here. The other thing I want you to remember, there are 80,000 people who are identified as indigenous, federally enrolled, who are in New York City today, right? This is not a place that does not have indigenous peoples. There are indigenous peoples everywhere. But that removal is the reason we don't think about them.
Yes, Duncan.
Can you go more to the specifics of the foundation grant, like the size of it and the breakdown? Just more details about what it's doing.
Yes. So the Humanities for All Times initiative was to come up with curricular development in the humanities and arts in the support of students interested in social justice. So our curriculum developing is run through the American Studies program. It's interdisciplinary, it's humanities-based. We wanted to be able to bring in postdocs to expand the expertise and courses that we're offering. Our postdocs are trained in Native American and Indigenous studies as an emerging field. They're starting their careers. This is a great way to develop courses and also have time for their own research. So they'll be more successful as they move forward as academics, and our students benefit. We also have reading groups. The fall reading group is being run by Professor Pinar Kamerly, who is in Middle Eastern studies and in political studies, thinking about theoretical questions of indigeneity, not just in North America, but broadly around the world. It's for students, it's for staff, it's for faculty. To, again, try to break down some of the barriers that are in higher education that we end up siloed, where it's like, staff do this one thing, students do this one thing, to have spaces where we talk to each other. We also have the conferences, which are going to be open to the whole community, where we bring in experts to talk about questions around archives, indigenizing the liberal arts, and food and memory. That's in the third year. We have themes. So last year's theme, or I should say this year's continuing theme, is rereading America, thinking about America's really complex and layered history. Next year's theme is deep listening, right? And the ways in which the humanities can support this. We also have these consultations with the community. Some of our funding is explicitly focused on giving funds to support efforts that the Stockbridge Muncie community is making here in either language reclamation or archives, in reinterpretation of Montgomery Place, so that we can put real money to help them, so that they don't have to apply for that, but they get to decide what that money is spent on. The artists in residence, Suzanne Height is our first artist in residence. She's Oglala Lakota. She thinks about food and memory in different ways. She makes memory cakes. She's also going to be working with the biennial this year at the Fisher Center. So she's going to be giving a talk in the fall thinking about embodied archival practice and art. And then she's going to be doing a performance in the spring with the biennial around that. So it's really kind of layered to create a stable of courses that will result in a Native American and Indigenous Studies concentration within American Studies at the end of 3 years, that will allow us to be able to recruit and support Native students who want to come to BAR, so that we have the structures to be able to assist in this, to be able to create semi-permanent or permanent installations of contemporary Native artwork here, and also to be able to deepen our dialogue with the Stockbridge Munsee community. So that's the 36-month program, but with the idea this, we really see this, 1.5 million sounds like a lot of money. It's seed money to start the scaffold that has to be then built and maintained over time with the community and open this up to Native students and faculty beyond Stockbridge.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but Mellon always wants to see the work that has begun with this funding to live on, right? The sustainability of the initiative is really critical to the foundation.
Exactly.
Other questions? Oh, in back? Yes.
All right, I have two questions actually. My first question is, what would your response be to somebody who felt as if this acknowledgement is performative?
Is performative?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what land acknowledgements are, right? The moral capital redounds to the institution that places it everywhere and that speaks it. So to me, this is why best practices require, number one, not fostering this all over the place, because what's the point of that? It's not, I don't want it to become background noise. It's just something that we walk past. And number two, to me, the only reason I was willing to do this was with the commitment of, and then we're going to go get grants to support this, right? And then we're going to use this to try and talk to donors to be able to develop funding lines to support Native students coming here free of tuition. And we're going to try and hire faculty to expand Native American and Indigenous studies. And we're going to think about what it means to actually do this. Because otherwise, our land acknowledgement is performative, right? That critique that's made by communities is very real. But it's on us to take that forward and do something with it. So when I say this is to the life of the institution, we didn't get to do this so that Barb would look good. We did this to be able to think about how we can take the unique platform that we have here to build this out, to support the Stockbridge Munsee community, but also to educate others, right? To give you an example, Mellon gave us 36 months. 36 months is not a lot of time. And for a community that is trying to deal with healthcare, elder care, childcare, all sorts of academic issues, we're the last of their priorities. So one of the things that I want to be able to take back to the Mellon Foundation at the end of this, besides saying, here's what we did, here are the classes that we're going to be able to move forward, here's our recruitment strategy, here's the way that we're supporting things, is to say, and by the way, we need to talk about 36 months is not enough time, right? Because this is what our community partners are telling us. And since I get to be in the room and talk to you, I'm going to say, we need to think about changing the structures so that they support the communities and not just the nonprofits that are built on the Euro American model. So it takes time. It's not instantaneous. But remembering that it's really easy to slip into this becoming performative is always the guidepost to say, what can we do now? What can we do better? You have a second question too.
I do have a second question. So you said that the statement with doing the force removal is very important to this piece. If it was so important, why is it only one sentence?
That was because the community wanted to place the emphasis on futurity and everything that was coming afterwards. So say that there's forced removal, acknowledge it, don't dwell on it, do it in your classes, do it in the education, but we're not living in the past because we are a present people. We have generations, our responsibility is to 7 generations forward. So recognize that you did wrong, come to your understanding of the denial of doing wrong, but place the emphasis on what you can do for the future and what we can do better that doesn't dwell in that past. It might change. As I said, we're in the process of recertification. If they decide that they want more airspace for this, and that's part of that dialogic process, right? What do you want this to do? What does the community want other people to do?
I think this might be a good moment to transition into having Myra speak about the acknowledgement statement of slavery and explain.
Thank you. And thank you. Is this on?
Can you hear Myra?
Bill?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for not only a deeply insightful reflection on this, but a passionate one. I think that is very important. We can begin with a question, since performativity was raised by Imani. What use should we derive as a learning community from the slavery acknowledgement statement? Oh, and by the way, it hasn't been read. Would somebody like to volunteer to read it? Yes, please, thank you.
Howard College acknowledges that its origins are intertwined with slavery, which has shaped the United States and American institutions from the beginning. Starting in the 16th century, European traders trafficked approximately 12 million Africans to the Americas, where they were held as property and forced to work as enslaved laborers. Their descendants were also held as slaves in perpetuity. The exploitation of enslaved people was at the foundation of the economic development of New York and the Hudson Valley, including land now composing the Bard College campus. In the early 18th century, Baron Van Veldhuizen purchased most of this land and was a slave owner. Later owners of the property also relied on black workers they held in bondage for material gain. Montgomery Place, which became part of the college in 2016, was a working farm during the 19th century that likewise profited from the labor of enslaved people. The founders of Bard College, John Bard, 1819 to 1899, and Margaret Johnson Bard, 1825 to 1875, inherited wealth from their families and used it to found the college. That inheritance was implicated in slavery on both sides. John's grandfather, Samuel Bard, 1742 to 1821, owned slaves. His father, William Bard, 1778 to 1853, was the first president of the New York Life Insurance Company, which insured enslaved people as property. Margaret's fortune derived from her father's commercial firm, Borman and Johnston, which traded in tobacco, sugar, and cotton produced by enslaved labor throughout the Atlantic world. Other early benefactors of the college, such as John Lloyd Aspinwall, 1816 to 1873, also derived a significant proportion of their wealth, which they donated to the college, from commercial ventures that depended on slavery. John and Margaret Bard devoted their lives and monies to educational pursuits. In his retirement, John Aspinwall redirected his fortune and energies toward humanitarian pursuits.
Thank you very much.
Recognition and redress of this history are due. As students, teachers, researchers, administrators, staff, and community members, we acknowledge the pervasive legacy of slavery and commit ourselves to the pursuit of equity and restorative justice for the descendants of enslaved people within the Bard community.
Oh, thank you. I'm very embarrassed to say that very critical statement I almost cut off. So again, I'll go back to the question that I raised. What use should we as a learning community make of this slavery acknowledgement statement? And the comments and thoughts that I'd like to offer are both from an intellectual point of view and a practical level. And some of these can be, I would say, more narrowly applied to people of color of African descent who find themselves here, but I would hope that what I have to say is also generally applicable to all of us. Social and cultural historians, geographers, art historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, and I could go on, economic historians, sociologists, and even further, have sought to understand the meanings that people attach to physical environments, both natural environment resulting solely from forces of nature, forests, lakes, woodlands, and the like, mountains, and the built environments resulting from human manipulation of the natural environment. So bridges, dams, buildings like this one that we're in, yards, gardens, things that might seem natural, but are actually manipulations. I come to this, the contribution to this slavery acknowledgement statement as an African American descended from enslaved people, And through my training in urban history, which was very broad, I came to graduate school with broad questions about rurality and urbanity and the relationship between the two. And I found myself over time narrowing to the African American experience because it became more compelling to me. And also because of the way in which my own autobiography did not seem to fit the way in which contemporary urbanologists were approaching African American experience. That approach tended to focus on late 20th century industrialization, ghettoization, the formation of that. And I wanted to understand the connection between the two. I could say more about that. So the list of scholars who shaped my perspective is long and interdisciplinary. And I'm just going to mention a few because I think it would be useful to you as you begin to think about place more generally, as Professor Crouch has mentioned. So this is sort of a kind of, throw the whole list against the wall and see, who stands out in your mind. This is not systematic in any way. Elizabeth Blackmore stood out to me because she, in her study of Manhattan, arguably still our premier city, pioneered an understanding which seems pretty self-evident now, but the idea of the commodification of land, the development of real estate markets, urban real estate markets, and New York City being the sort of prototype for that elsewhere as the nation developed. Well, that was an innovation. Nobody had ever really thought about that. We commodify the air in New York City. You get air rights for building up. That is quite an imaginative approach to privatization. Neil Cronin, 19th century study of Chicago, demonstrated the falsity of distinctions that we make between the rural and the urban. We very often think of the ways in which the city encroaches upon the urban, critiques of urban sprawl. But one of the key innovations of Cronin was to talk about how rural people created the city and how the two are inextricably connected. Henri Lefebvre, who talked about the social production of space, that's almost self-explanatory, and confirms the ways in which social hierarchies are reproduced through spatial practices. David Harvey, interested very much in social justice, particularly focused on poor areas and the ways in which capitalism reproduced poor areas and created them. Michel de Certeau, looking at the gap between official designations of space, the way urban planners imagine space, and the way people actually use space. And what does that say about power? Edward Soja, looking at homeless people, and the ways in which space is regulated to prohibit access. In this body of literature, we get such notions as transgressive space or interdicted space, and how it's created through things like cul-de-sac, which, block passage from one end to another of areas, or the removal of benches in cities. Now, this is my synthesis, so these individuals are very, very different, but I'm going to lump them together for the sake of time. Dolores Hayden, Mary Ryan, Daniel Greenberg, from very different fields. But for me, they chart and they critique assumptions of historic preservationists that value monumental structures, classical structures, like the Parthenon or Grand Central Station, cathedrals, the homes of wealthy mansions like Blythewood or Ward Manor, or better, Montgomery Place, since it is a National Historic Park. And they call for examinations of what Dolores Hayden called vernacular architecture. What ordinary people, the spaces that ordinary people tend to occupy for most of their lives: factories, warehouses, streets, tenements, plazas, squares. And I'll just give you one last one. Fernando Santos Granero, who works at the Smithsonian, training in cultural anthropology, looking at the Peruvian Amazon, Amazon people, the Yamesha or the Amuesha people, and focuses on map making. And you will encounter this in many of your classes, history classes, for sure. I'm not exactly sure, maybe some of the anthropology classes will tackle this, but the idea, again, of official space that is created, in this case, by by the conquistadors, the Spanish, official places of governance, for example, and the way in which they determined the way the land would be represented on paper, and contrasting that with the mental maps that were kept by indigenous peoples, temples, burial sites, places of desecration, and how they honored them. So all of these perspectives call for a fuller history of the landscape, what some people have called writing history into the landscape, histories that have not been seen before. So you can see how these perspectives can lead to a more expansive approach to slavery and slaveholding, and how it was experienced by enslaved people and even the enslavers. So I just want to just quickly bullet point some of the ways in which the land acknowledgement statement sort of intersects with these ideas. Well, first of all, it obviously follows upon the land acknowledgement statement. And I'll say this, I was inspired to do this by Christiane's introduction, in talking about the specifics of how the land acknowledgement statement came about. I mean, these were things that I had been thinking about anyway. And I would argue that BARD is a capitalist formation, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But when I say capitalist formation, what I mean is that what we see is the physical manifestation of a classic capitalist formula, that you take land, labor, and what is called capital to produce profit. Land, we understand. Labor, we understand. Capital is the money, later on, it's the actual infrastructure, the factory, the building, the machines, the tools, in order to produce labor. So these two statements go together in my mind in confirming that. So you needed the land, you needed the capital, you needed the labor in order to produce the landscape that we have. But beyond that, in terms of the history of BARD, once the land acknowledgement statement was made, there were students who, and staff members who were concerned about the need for a slavery acknowledgement statement, because they felt that their complicity had to be explained, that it was forced complicity if they were descended from African people, because their work was coerced out of them. I would say also along these lines that what is an interesting thing to consider is aesthetics in all of this. The Hudson Valley is a cultural landscape that has been preserved and honored and glorified in many, many ways, and probably most famously for the Hudson River school of painting. And, it's just sort of seen as naturally beautiful. And yet, the natural beauty that we claim obviously is constructed and was constructed at a cost. And the slavery acknowledgement statement, I feel, is necessary in order to acknowledge that. So the beauty of this campus, the way it's strung together, it's a collection, it's a thread of estates. Andrew Jackson Downing, the foremost landscape historian, the pioneer landscape historian, many people would say, in US history, started the magazines and basically the intellectual culture around landscape gardening. And he used Montgomery Place in the 1840s as an example of this. And yet that hides the way in which this beauty was enabled, by enslaved people and their descendants. Also, this whole project of deforestation, for those of you who are interested in environmental history and environmental issues, I am, thank God, almost done with a long project in collaboration with the Organization of American Historians and the National Park Service to reinterpret the battlegrounds of the Saratoga National Park, which contained the house, the summer house of General Philip Schuyler, who was in charge of the Northern Department of the U.S. Army. And one of the aspects that I elaborate on at length, because it was such a discovery to me, was the massive deforestation that took place. Now, that's something I think we realize, but the extent to which enslaved labor was put to that task is something that we need to think about when we enjoy the beauty. What we understand is the beauty of this campus, the meadows, the rolling hills, the manicured look of it all. And then also that the barns, the bricks, the lumber, which came from this deforestation, the mills that were necessary to process, the lumber. All of this was manned, literally manned, by people of African descent. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that when we think about this campus and how it came to be constructed, the buildings, the literal buildings, the older buildings, Bartiston was begun at St. Stephen's in 1860, depended on the wealth of people who were either directly complicit or generationally people who benefited from wealth that was complicit in slavery and slave making. So you see that in the statement in talking about Aspinwall, whose family firm was the largest mercantile outfit in New York City, which meant in the country in the first third of the 19th century. And it was very much involved in importing goods that were produced with slave labor. Now, he was retired when he came here, and the principals were deeply religious people and notably anti-slavery. So I think as we, really deeply reflect on these statements, what we should be led to is a deep reflection on the connection between ideology and practice. What we say we believe and what we do. I don't believe these people were necessarily hypocritical. I think that there were very, very complex ways in which believers in capitalism and and business people were able to make distinctions between the free labor contract and forced labor, and that sort of exonerated them. But I would encourage you that as you think about these issues, that they are not just historical issues. They are issues that are with us today. And I encourage students to think about our own complicity in our purchases. Next time, not a coffee drinker, but the next time you pick up a latte or a cappuccino, you might want to think about who produced those beans and to what extent do those conditions, the conditions under which those beans were produced and collected, replicate in many ways chattel slavery. Just a couple more things I'll say, and I'll say them very quickly. In thinking about space and learning, I just finished teaching a summer course on the history of education in this country, focused mainly on public school education. And in looking at the colonial period, we talked a lot about traditional modes of learning, and we looked at indigenous learning, and even the original settler form of learning. Clearly, there was a transformation that took place, so that by the early 19th century, we're thinking of education as something that must take place inside buildings, inside classrooms. And then we further refine that to say what the ideal physical setup of a classroom is. So at a place like Bard, we value the circular, dialogic, seminar table, etc. We're in an auditorium, and there's a certain kind of learning that takes place there. I think that in a conceptual way, thinking about space, thinking about slavery, thinking about traditional learning, will encourage us, or it should push us to think and maybe want to incorporate some of the benefits of traditional learning. Now, I'm just going to put in a plug for CCE and engagement with communities, sort of replicating what Professor Crouch said, but sort of generalizing from it. Let me just sort of say one other thing. I'm going to truncate all that I have here so I can open it up. But finally, what I want to talk about, and there is an overlap with what you had to say, and that has to do with this issue of belonging and the way in which we need to rethink the notion of first generation. This idea of inclusion and having new populations, people of color who are coming in. And we talk about that as the first generation. And when we do that, we reify the notion of the founders, the ones who were at the beginning as students who were here. But when we take this longer historical look, at this place as a capitalist formation, we will understand that people who are marginalized, enslaved people, I will add, indigenous people, were there at the beginning in the creation of this capitalist formation. And I hope, and here I would speak to people who are first generation, who come from these communities, who might feel out of place, that, oh no, you are very much in a place that you helped to create in ways perhaps that were exclusive of you, that did not provide you access, but that you can claim ownership based on these historical relationships. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I want to thank you for that comment about first generation students. I was a first generation student myself. I wish someone had said that when I was sitting in my first year classes, so thank you. We have time for questions. We can weave together questions that go across the two presentations, since we're running a little short on time.
I'm just gonna project rather than, you kind of talked about this idea of like putting things into practice. Do you have any advice, and this goes to both of you, for people who are trying to, put things in not just an anti-racist or an anti-Semitic or an anti-homophobic type of practice, but to really put it together into an intersectional kind of view? Just kind of help you.
I would really ask you to be a little bit more specific about what you mean, so I can answer.
Sure. Sorry, that was, is there anything on campus that you would recommend to people who are looking for an intersectional way of applying this kind of theory you're working on in class?
Oh, okay, all right, thank you very much. I really wish that Erin Cannon was here or Cicely Wilson, but I do know that there is an initiative with regard to crafts and community peoples, I think indigenous communities, and
Yes, to this point, I think CCE, so Erin Cannon and Cicely Wilson, but also Paul Marienthal, who runs the Trustee Leader Scholar Program, and Kathleen McManus, who's the site manager at Montgomery Place, have been talking about amplifying crafts-based education or initiatives that bring different people together around this.
right. I would say the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a very robust expansion of connections to Kingston in particular, and public history works that are very inclusive, bringing in artists from BIPOC communities. Again, the rethinking, I think, more deeply the idea of civic engagement along these lines. There's a long tradition, fairly long tradition, everything in history is relative, of something called service learning, but civic engagement is a much more refined concept that began to emerge in the last dozen years or so along these lines, yeah. Yes.
I was just wondering, going off of both of the discussions, if there are any programs in CCE that directly correlate with these acknowledgements that aren't just kind of like broadly related, because you had talked about like the way that part is acknowledging communities, and I'm wondering if there's a way for direct student involvement with what you're doing.
Basically, if I heard you correctly, you're wondering if some on the community side, in other words, on the non-campus side, whether the groups that CCE connects students with also have land acknowledgement.
No, like within BARD, are there things like programs you would mention centers of engagement? Are there programs specifically through CCE that are accessible to students that directly correlate?
Okay, so the answer to that is that within BARD, CCE has an initiative called ELAS courses, Engageable Arts and Sciences. So that I would refer you to those courses that have content that speak to the issues that Professor Crouch and I raised, okay? So those are not necessarily projects per se, they're courses. They may have a component, a civic engagement component that involves students connecting to community groups along those lines. So you go through the syllabus and you look for courses that are designated ELAS in capital letters. But I do want to say something about the community side, because as I believe Professor Crouch said, a number of not-for-profit groups have adopted land acknowledgement statements. And I'm less familiar with, I don't know, I cannot name not-for-profit groups that have adopted slavery acknowledgement statements per se. But when I think practically about opportunities in Kingston, for instance, there's a landmarks preservation commission. And it has been involved in projects like the slave burial sites that have been uncovered. Probably the best known one was of someone who owned a house, wanted to build a swimming pool next door to the house, bought that lot, which was an asphalt covered, lot, and began digging and discovered all these bones that turned out to be a slave burial ground. And so there have been community discussions about that. There are lots of debates that are, from what I understand, still ongoing. But to the extent that CCE is connecting students to those kinds of projects, there is a kind of implicit use of slavery acknowledgement, and those kinds of projects are happening all over the place. I mean, I say to people that the bones are just coming up. They're just coming up all over the place. So
I would say the Bark Farm is a great place to start. So one of the things that the Bark Farm coordinator, Rebecca Yoshino, was doing this summer was working with the Lenape Center, which is based in New York City, on a blue corn heirloom rematriation project, and that uses student volunteers to go weed the fields. And that sounds like super unglamorous work, and it's hot and it's tiring, but Rebecca's background was working with Wasabi Community Gardens in Minnesota, which was a Lakota project, which helped us support Sean Sherman's Tatanka food truck. We've engaged in a lot of seed rematriation projects here. The farm also has engaged in or started doing maple tapping in the spring. We gifted some of that maple syrup to tribal representatives when they came in June. So if you want a tangible way to connect to some of this work, that's a great place to start. We're going to be building out more programming around this as we start to get signage and approval from the tribal council. So I'm happy. We have a website called rethinkingplace.bar.edu, and as more things come up, we'll be posting on that. But I would definitely recommend go talk to Rebecca and the team at the farm, because they're really invested in food sovereignty, food justice, and rematriation projects.
So, do you think there could be a revision to the slavery acknowledgement where the historical figures from Montgomery and Gilson Place would be mentioned along with some of their, like a brief picture about who they are?
that there will be a revision to mention them
Do you think there could be, or there should be?
in the statement.
Like, do you think that should be added in?
I suppose there could be. I should say a little bit about the history of Montgomery Place. In crafting the slavery acknowledgement statement, we were, perhaps I was, so relatively long durée focused on the founding of BARD, that, those are the people that we picked up. Montgomery Place was purchased by BARD only in 2016. But I think you have a good point.
Yes. Right down front.
So, where it mentions that John Margaret Barr devote their money to education pursuits and also pass them all towards humanitarian pursuits, with what intent was this placed into the development?
What?
Say
Say that again. Oh.
So, right after it mentions, how they made their wealth.
I think what it was to do, quite frankly, is that's an excellent question, very perceptive question. I think what it intended to do was to remove direct complicity, direct involvement away from those people. This statement was sort of crafted within the context of a larger movement within academia and over slavery and complicity. So, for example, Samuel Bard, or there's a Kruger village here, and the grandfather of the Kruger here was a direct slave trader. Kruger himself never was involved in it, was kind of and so that's, we wanted to say that this happened, that, there was this connection, that the wealth that was created through, the use of slave labor, did touch the lives of people who were principals in early Bard, but that they were not directly involved. And I think even further, that they, in their anti-slavery formulation, decided not to pursue it. Okay, because that did happen. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a teacher here with LNT, and I was hoping that maybe you could put together some of the great suggestions that you've come up with for student involvement, and maybe send them to Bill Dixon so we can pass them on to our students.
That is an incredible suggestion. Can we do that? We can do that.
Sure.
I also wanted to ask Christiane to speak just briefly about some of the work we'll be having on biennial at Montgomery Place with an art installation that we've been talking about.
Yes, so we have a biennial at the Fisher Center for the Performing Arts that will be taking place starting this fall, but will actually carry over into the spring. It is being co-curated by Gideon Lester, who's the artistic director of the Fisher Center, and Tanya El-Khoury, who is faculty in theater and performing arts and is one of the directors of the Center for Human Rights and the Arts, and where we have a Human Rights and the Arts Masters. So the theme for the biennial this year is seeds and food sovereignty. We have an artist in residence who is going to be joining us, Vivian Sansour, who is a Palestinian activist and who has thought a lot about the questions of food and memory and how they fit in with indigeneity. We are also going to be having a performance this fall by cooking sections. The website for the biennial will be coming up October 13th through 16th at the Fisher Center. But one of the artists who has been invited for the biennial is Jordan Weber, who is an incredible thinker who sits at this question of intersectionality of Black and Native tradition, and who is engaging Montgomery Place and the landscape as a site to think through and have an installation that commemorates the enslaved laborers who lived on the site, saw and helped shape the site, and whose legacies have been too long overshadowed, literally, by a giant house overlooking a lawn to the river. So I would certainly encourage students to think about this. There will also, I suspect, if any previous biennials are an example of this, there are opportunities for student engagement to get involved. The Fisher Center often hires from within the undergraduate body. There are prorated tickets or free tickets for students. So please do take advantage of this, because there's a synergy with some of the questions that have come up that will be expressed in this. And we'll make sure that that information gets out to LNT as well.
I have a question about the slavery acknowledgement. Why were the words Black workers held in bondage why were those words chosen over words like enslaved people or enslaved Black people?
They could have been chosen. Do you see a distinction?
To me, the word worker has different connotations than enslaved. So I was just curious whether that was to focus on the labor aspect or something else.
I think the labor aspect, in terms of, I can speak for myself. The labor aspect, I have worked I have taught labor history, and, in talking to you about capitalism, and this is a capitalist formation, I do see slavery fundamentally as a labor system. And there are others, Cedric Robinson being the most prominent theorist in the 70s, who brought forth this idea of racial capitalism. His idea of racial capitalism is broader than most people think. He sees its origins in the old world, not in the new world, and that, he argues that wherever capitalism began to emerge, it always worked in tandem with existing social hierarchies, so that there were always marginalized people who, filled those roles of, sort of a proto-proletariat, so to speak. So the gypsies, the Roma, in some ways, Jews, Slavs for sure, and that it was in the Atlantic world context, in the American context, that it became Africanized. And so racial capitalism took on a particular kind of definition. And I would say that within the context of American discussions of race, very often we forget that longer history. So for me, as a student of labor and sort of a more global understanding, that's what's going on. And I'm not shying away from the idea of enslaved labor. I am aware of the momentum that developed about 15 years ago to move away from the use of slave and to adopt the moniker, the enslaved, to talk about this as a process, to honor the fact that Africans were at one point free within their societies, and that they were, that enslavement was a process, that they were taken captive and then they were made into slaves through various processes of seasoning, or, to borrow Professor Crouch's language, various middle passages. So.
I think on that note, we should probably draw to a close. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, great, Tika. Okay, very good. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, take care, you too.
this major profession. So I do as very
Oh, you're kidding. Yeah, so what was his name? Oh, yes, I would say non-religious. Yes. I didn't know he was. Okay.
But also to kind of bring back no
I am aware of that, and it's just usually, so all I know is that his name always appears in any street and amateur or
we had a mascot.
slavery.
And it's like,
Found people in New York and Valley, John Rodriguez, and that's it. So there's work to be done. I could do some digging to see if there's been such a firm.
and we're not just one people, there's so many.
So, there's
Yeah, I
probably
just really
more.
appreciated that.
But, that's all I can do right now. Yes, it's window one Montgomery Place.
Normally I have teachers, students,
Oh, okay. Yeah, so window.
student advisory.
Okay, are you? Yeah. Oh, sure, are you in the area? Okay,
To the library tea, if you have time this afternoon.
Oh,
I don't get busy weekend. Just stay briefly and I will see you later.
really early.
So, everyone.
Three.
Well done, Michael. You're batting, you're batting average.
Well, I didn't do that.
But I can't do the semester, and I just told them I can't. And they're scrambling for somebody to do it. Yeah, do you know, I mean, it's easy, Armstead and Florida.
I love the part.
Thank you. Okay, and if you move, yeah, I mean, we have, because the class starts, yes, you gotta get 2 weeks, it's high school juniors.
Hey, Christiana. Good. Unfortunately, I had to kind of wait a little bit, but 10 minutes if we talk about.
And you can't do this.
Right.
Yeah. Right, and bringing that into what.
I could give you a syllabus. It's so easy, it's a challenge. No, I'm serious, if you have an interest, it's a challenge, I will say it's a challenge, because the students are coming from
Right.
high school,
Right.
maybe,
It's a question that's probably-
let's see, we have 7 to 14.
Right.
That element in money, who kept asking questions.
Did a great, great.
And it's different.
Started
Yeah.
in 2 years ago, which is the classic one. But it's been literally, for the class, the class is at OC Center, office, well, it's Hyde Park.
I just want.
But it's a part of Hyde Park that is.
Oh, you guys
I remember
So
going
it's
to class, I remember, I
It's
was
a slow
history.
point, slow point on Turnpike.
And
And
earlier,
yeah,
yeah,
to Concord going south. From
And I
right
remember
there, you will see Salt Lake
Like,
Turnpike.
half of this.
And you turn there and you go several
And
miles.
you rode
And
much
you come to this big industrial complex, and BOCES is the county facility for students who are doing vocational education.
And they kind of woke me up in a literal and figurative.
Carpenters or
And,
whatever. But you needed a central site because we draw students from
Little things, but.
Red Book, from Rogers, from different schools. And those school districts provide buses for the students to come in and take the bar classes. But it's not like the colleges, whole thing. So that's the challenge, is that you're dealing with traditional kids with that mindset. And so, they're used to sort of sitting and being told and not reading, and you're trying to engage them beyond, just pass the test. So it's hard, I have to say. The next year, if they continue with the program by the time they are seniors, somehow or other something's put in. But you would be getting them that first semester, where you have to make it very clear, put the cell phone down, things like that, And, no, it's Friday, it's scheduled now for Thursday and Friday, from 12:15 to 1:45. And the textbook is chosen. It's Eric Fuller's, he's a well-known Columbia professor. He has a classic textbook on US history in 2 parts, which works well with the course. And the big innovation I was going to make, because I can share with you the syllabus that I used last time, is that I have to find a way, I was thinking, I have got to find a way to get them to read. So what I decided to do at the end of last year, after the class was ended, was instead of just saying, read this part of the textbook so that we can discuss it, because he will not have done that, is to make them responsible for presenting a part of the textbook, right? And, attached to a particular question. And to distribute that work regularly through the semester. It's your turn, your turn. So,
It sounds very interesting. I don't know if I will be teaching a class on Friday for sure. But I think it is. It's also a good one, but
long.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you would have to get there. And it's, it's such the building is so unconducive to us, because it's an industrial building, talking about space, it's big, and, the rooms have not the trendy brick walls,
Right.
but cinder blocks,
Yeah, but I'd be curious to learn more about the class you're teaching, and I'm interested in this historical character.
Young Rodriguez.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think somebody had to have done the research on him, where he came from. I'm pretty sure, he probably, let me think, Spanish, okay.
There's a Dominican Studies Center.
And Hunter.
Yeah.
No, that's Puerto Rican, study center at Puerto Rican, right?
He only has the Dominican
Studies,
Studies.
okay.
And all the papers I found are from them.
Okay, all right, so they, I'm sure someone has done something on him.
So it's so interesting because he was and then there are so many things that
Right.
hard to know which one is true, which one is not true, like his relationship with the natives, like he
Exactly.
decided to stay here.
Exactly. Yeah, so, I don't know, in Spanish, it was, yeah.